I lose my fear when the night is dark. Never shed a tear. Then the daylight comes. It scares me awake. When the daylight comes, it's when I have to fake. When the night is dark, I feel so free. When the night is dark, I feel at peace. Then the daylight comes, it scares me awake. When the daylight comes, it's when I have to fake. When the night is dark, I come alive. When the night is dark, I begin to thrive. When the daylight comes, it scares me awake. When the daylight comes, it's when I have to fake. When the daylight comes, it scares me awake. When the daylight comes, it's when I have to fake.
Bueno, ni más ni menos que Joseph LeDoux, neurocientífico, y Colin Dempsey, en esta gran serie de pensadores contemporáneos, les damos la más cordial bienvenida. Estamos hablando de un neurocientífico de la Universidad de Nueva York que explora en sus libros el cerebro emocional, ese es el título de uno de sus libros, y el más reciente se llama Ansiedad. Y entonces vamos a hablar de cómo es que estos personajes que tienen que ver con la neurociencia hacen canciones de un género que le llaman heavy mental. Joseph LeDoux, thank you very much for this interview.
Thank you for having us.
Let's talk about heavy mental. Okay. What is this genre about?
Well, this is a genre we invented for ourselves because we play music about mind and brain and mental disorders. In a sense, that's what all rock music is about, mind and brain and mental disorders, but we kind of coined our own term for it. And you know, we play mostly love songs. These are songs we started writing as part of our rock band, the Amygdaloids. And Colin and I split off from the Amygdaloids, not officially split off, but we branch off as a separate project to perform in these kinds of smaller venues. And so we do acoustic versions primarily of the Amygdaloid songs, but we write some of our own songs that are not part of the Amygdaloids catalog as well.
And this is a way also to explore what you do in your research. Let's talk about it because it resonates each with another.
Yeah, so, you know, I grew up in Louisiana where music is very popular, and I was exposed to a lot of music as a child. And by the time I was a teenager, the Beatles had arrived in America. And so everybody, of course, wanted to be a musician at that point. So I wanted to be a musician. I got rid of my folk guitar and bought an electric guitar. And, but I knew that I didn't have the talent to be a real musician. So I kind of continued to play music, but never really pursued it very seriously. And then at some point I figured out, well, maybe I can pursue music through the back door. I've achieved something in science, and let's turn science into songs and use that as a way not necessarily to be a professional musician, but to be a professional who does some music.
And why the interest in neuroscience and in the anxiety that is reflected in rock songs. Why do you make this kind of research specifically?
Oh, the research? Well, that, you know, it's as in anything in life, you go through step to step and you never know where the next step is going to take you. And I had actually 2 degrees in business administration, which I was not very fond of when I was studying it. And I happened to take a course with someone who was studying the brain, and I fell in love with that topic. And so I switched fields. And my original research was on the topic of consciousness in the brain in patients who had brain damage or brain surgery. And that led me to questions about emotion. And I decided at the time, this was in the 1970s, there weren't good techniques for studying the human brain. So I thought I should study emotion through studies of rodents, rats, and because we could go in and be more precise. And so that took me to a procedure. I had to find a procedure for making a rat have a kind of reaction to something that it didn't have a reaction to. And it seemed that the procedure called Pavlovian fear conditioning was a useful way to do that. So I started studying how a neutral stimulus paired with something aversive for the animal, like a mild shock to its feet, would create a set of responses like freezing and changes in blood pressure and heart rate that are very similar to what happens in a human when they undergo any kind of dangerous situation. So even though rats and people have different kinds of threats, the brain and body respond in a very similar way. So it was useful to be able to study it that way. So I started at a very different point and kind of got into it indirectly.
And then you choose to study fear and anxiety. Let's talk about the distinction Freud made about those terms.
So the usual difference is that fear is an emotion that you have in the presence of an immediately existing threat, whereas anxiety is a worry about an uncertain threat that will occur in the future. And whether it occurs or not doesn't matter. Whether it's real or not is not an issue. For example, someone who's anxious about alien abduction is just as anxious as someone worried about whether the snake at their feet is going to bite them. So usually, though, these 2 things in a situation of fear often turns into anxiety very quickly. So again, with the snake at your feet, first you're afraid that the snake will bite you, but then you start to worry that, you know, well, if it bites me, will I be able to get to a doctor? Will they have the medicine to treat it? If they don't, will I die? What will happen to my family? And so that's more of the anxiety, the worry about the future, rather than the immediate reaction to the snake.
So this has to do with imagination.
Yes. So anxiety is the price we pay for having a brain that can imagine the future. And that's a unique feature of the human brain. It allows us to imagine writing songs and writing novels and building buildings that don't exist. But it also allows us to worry about our future.
You said that your mother was a warrior?
Yeah, she worried, yeah.
And this is also very personal in trying to understand the emotional brain, because it's related with what happens in your life, directly in your life. So this is a way to understand what was your past and the memories and how they imprint into your present time.
So one of my most vivid memories from childhood was in Louisiana. We have bayous, you know, still bodies of water where there are lots of reptiles, especially snakes. And someone who worked for my parents had taken me to go fishing one afternoon. And we went to this place, this bayou, and it was covered with water moccasins, very dangerous snakes, poisonous snakes. And it seemed to my young mind that there were thousands of them there, maybe hundreds of thousands. I don't know, it seemed like a lot of snakes. And I never got that out of my head. So I've kind of always had a kind of snake phobia. So maybe that had something to do with my pursuit of fear as well.
Yeah, but you say also that, well, Kierkegaard said that fear has a positive trait also.
Well, fear is, yes, it's once you're afraid, that is a very useful perspective for marshaling all your brain's resources to make a plan to deal with it. So that's one thing that I think that the human brain is very good at, is using conscious experience as a way of integrating information and using that as a takeoff point for making decisions.
Mm-hmm. And in this way, you also research something that is very interesting, that is the fear to fear, because what triggers the response has to do with the fear of fearing itself. It's not the fear itself. It's like if you create some kind of phantom and you fight with the phantom, but not with the real thing.
Well, I guess anxiety is a kind of fear, you know, because it's a, once we're fearing fear, we're worrying. And anxiety is basically a worry disorder of anticipation and uncertainty.
And let's talk about the circuitry that is involved in this process of anxiety and fear. Okay. For example, the name of your band is Amygdaloids. So this has to do with the amygdala. And let's talk about what happens there and how it controls the emotional brain.
Well, the usual idea about the amygdala, and it's partly my fault, but I think it's wrong, is that the amygdala is a fear center. I think what the amygdala actually is a way of, it's a place or circuit in the brain that detects and responds to threats. The fear is the conscious awareness that that has happened. So those are two different things. And we tend to put them together as one thing in our minds as conscious human beings because these two things happen simultaneously to us. When we're running from the bear, we're also afraid. And so the assumption is that fear is what causes us to run from the bear. But William James long ago questioned that idea, saying we don't run from the bear because we're afraid. He said we're afraid because we run. I don't think that that's actually correct. I think that what James missed was a second step in the brain, which is that your brain first detects and responds to the danger. That causes you to run. And then you notice that you're running and that your heart is beating and that you personally are in danger. And that is when you begin to feel fear. So if you are afraid of a snake at your feet, the only way that that is an emotion for you is if you know that it's you that is in front of the snake. So you not only have to have the ability to be conscious that a stimulus like a snake is present, but you have to also be conscious that it's you that is experiencing that. Because if the snake is not going to bite you, then it's not making you afraid. You know, you have to be part of the representation for fear or any other emotion to exist. And I think only the human brain can do that. So some people don't like this idea because it says that animals don't have what humans call emotions. And I think that that's actually true. Animals may have, you know, animal emotions, but they don't have the kind of emotions we have that in which we have ourself, our personal self, me, Joseph LeDoux, is part of that representation of the snake that is about to bite me. Because it's a very complicated thing that I think has evolved with the elaboration of the prefrontal cortex in the human brain to be self-aware in this way.
You also talk about the pathways that runs from the neocortex through the amygdala. So let's talk what advantages and what disadvantages have to manage fear, and in which ways we can manage fear.
So one of the first discoveries I made in the 1980s when I was starting this research was that there's actually a shortcut to the amygdala. As the sensory information is coming into the eyes and the ears and so forth, normally it goes up to the neocortex, where you have the visual cortex and the auditory cortex, and we have our perceptions. But what we discovered was that there was a pathway that exits early in the visual pathway or the auditory pathway at the level of the thalamus, which is the station before the cortex. And that pathway goes directly to the amygdala. So you can have a very rapid amygdala response to a snake, allowing you to freeze before your cortex slowly builds up the idea that, oh, there's a snake there and that I'm about to be bitten. You've already frozen by that point. By the time your prefrontal cortex knows that you're in the presence of a snake, you've protected yourself. And you notice yourself protecting yourself. And that's part of this monitoring of your behavior and your internal states allows you to be afraid.
The flight or fight response, it's involved there?
That's the first part. That's the non-conscious activation of the amygdala.
And then, but the pathways from each other are different. More pathways from the amygdala to the neocortex?
Well, yeah, so in the emotional brain, I described it that way, that there are many more pathways from the amygdala to the cortex than from the cortex to the amygdala. I think that was probably a little bit of inaccurate, but it's what we thought at the time. But we know a lot more now. And if we restrict it to, what I was actually talking about at that point was that a certain part of the prefrontal cortex, called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, where we make a lot of decisions, a lot of our conscious decision making takes place, does not have any connections with the amygdala. But the amygdala is able to influence that by its many connections to the cortex. So what I was trying to get at, it's very easy for us to for our thoughts to be affected by the amygdala, but harder for our thoughts to control the amygdala. So the bottom up from the amygdala influences the cortex more easily than the cortex can turn off the amygdala. It's very hard to just say, okay, I'm not going to be anxious, right?
That's the difference between doing a therapy with narrative or doing a therapy with medicines that can allow the impulses, the chemicals to reduce the connection with
I think so that's the pharmaceutical approach can potentially do that, and I think that's what the drugs are actually doing primarily, is affecting the subcortical circuits, because when you develop a medication by studying animals, what you're studying is the animal's behavioral responses. So if you find that a rat spends more time in a dangerous place when it's on a certain medication, in other words, the rat is less timid in that situation, then you assume that a person will feel less fearful, because it's assumed that the amygdala is responsible both for fear and the timidity. But what you find is that when you give people those medications, they don't feel less fearful. What they feel is less timid.
Oh, so that's a distinction.
Yes, very important distinction. So a person with social anxiety, for example, will find it easier to go to a party when given the medication, but still feel anxious when they're at the party. So the person thinks the drug is a failure because the doctor told the person that they would feel less anxious. But the drug is doing exactly what it was doing in the laboratory when it was designed. It's making the person, like the rat, less timid. And because we've misunderstood that, the medications have been sold under false pretense. I don't think, there was no evil involved. It's just that our understanding, scientific understanding, has been stuck on this idea that the amygdala is a fear center.
And how we could change that and doing the pharmaceutical approach more accurate?
Well, I think it's probably not possible to change the content of a conscious experience with medications. It's important that we realize what medications are good for and what they're not good for. All medications, of course, have side effects, but they also have imprecise effects in terms of what we understand. So if we expect a medication developed in an animal to change a human's conscious experience,
it's a different kind of...
It's a very different thing, and I think we can't do that. So I think, as you said, maybe medications can be useful for calming the brain down, and then allowing the person-to-person contact through psychotherapy to work better.
Through psychotherapy, but there is a structural limitation in the way the narrative also can affect the amygdala or all the centers that have to do with fear.
Right, so the step one, I think, is to find ways to turn off the amygdala. So one way to do that, for example, if you have say a person with a spider phobia, would be to present the spider pictures subliminally. In other words, unconsciously. You do that by presenting it for a brief flash, very brief presentation. And when you do that, it goes to the amygdala, but it doesn't go to the prefrontal cortex. So you don't know the stimulus is there, but it can weaken your amygdala, theoretically. This is not proven, this is theoretical. You can weaken the amygdala subliminally, so the person, when he sees the stimulus, is no longer going to freak out because the spider is there. And now you can weaken the conscious memories, And once you've done that, the brain is prepared to do psychotherapy.
When
So you're not trying to have the prefrontal cortex turn off the amygdala because you've done that in another way.
When you talk about that, you say that there is also some kind of familiarization with anxiety. For example, you talk about Emily Dickinson, that she deals with anxiety so much time that it's almost dear to her. So
that's what she said. Yeah.
That's what she says. But let's talk about. You made a song about it.
Yes, right.
But why it's so interesting to you, this thing of understanding how you can, instead of fearing it, just be in love or be at peace that the fear is there.
That's a very kind of Eastern meditative perspective, and I think that meditation is a very useful thing in these disorders, and more people should probably try that. And maybe Emily Dickinson was kind of naturally figuring that out for herself. So I think it's important that, I've been practicing some meditation myself, just to try to learn more about it and understand it. And it's very interesting how one of the strategies is, let's say you have a pain in your leg. So rather than just trying to block that out all the time, you accept it. You acknowledge that it's there. And then actually when you acknowledge that you have a pain and let it be, recognize it as part of you, it somehow is blunted a little bit. It's not quite as, it's not out there, it's in here, it's part of you, and you just have to kind of cope with it better. And I think meditation helps you do that.
And this has to do with the impulse that runs through your research to trying to understand what happens inside of your mind.
That's right.
So why don't we sing a song about it?
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, we'll sing Inside of Me.
Inside of Me.
All right.
Think so I am, feel so I must be. Sometimes I don't know what is to be me. See your eyes staring at me, they're sharp as knives, but what do they see? You can't see. Side of me, that's a place only I can be. My soul has passions, it's trying to feel, searching for desire, nothing seems real. Will is weak, it's not very free, there's nothing to get hung about, that's just the deal. You can't see, side of me, that's the place only I can be. You can't see, you can see, side of me, that's the place only I can be. Think so I am, think so I am, feel so I must be, so I must be. Sometimes I don't know, it's to be me. Think so I am, feel so I must be. Sometimes I don't know, it's to be me. You can't see, inside of me, inside of me. That's a place only I can be, only I can be, only I can be, only I can be.
This is something that tells you the difficulty of really getting connected with the other and of having a theory of the mind of the other, and if that really fits with what you're thinking, it's happening inside the other person.
That's right.
Let's talk about it. How do you want to research that? Because that has to do with consciousness. The consciousness, we were talking about rats and the problem of trying to test what happens to rats and then being extrapolated to the human being. But we have also problems not with rats, just with the other.
So there's a lot of research on theory of mind, and especially in relation to autism. People with autism seem to have a problem in putting themselves in the minds of other people. So this causes them to be socially awkward and so forth, and it's a difficult problem. But also in relationships, anytime there's a misunderstanding, it's because we don't get inside of each other's minds so well. So we wrote a song about that called Map of Your Mind, and I think we'll do that if that's okay.
Okay, sure. Map of your mind. So trying to see what it happens.
Yeah, it's most of our songs are love songs, so it's about how two people in a relationship try to map each other's minds, and it's from the perspective of me trying to map someone else's mind.
And then let's talk about what you're trying to do in scientific research, or what is happening in the scientific research to trying to see what is going on there.
Okay.
Okay?
Made a map of your mind. I've charted my course. I'm sailing deep inside. Got the winds of force. Got the heat of your heart. Keep me from the cold. Got the currents of will. Take me to your soul. On the journey that I got to take. It's a trip that I knew I'd make. An excursion for needed desire. It's a voyage fueled by fire. Made a map of your mind. I've charted my course. I'm sailing deep inside. Got the winds of force. Got the heat of your heart. Take me from the cold. Got the currents of will. Take me to your soul. I'm just hoping my sails will be true. Let them take me straight to you. Let the winds blow strong from the sweet. So when I land on my mind will meet. got the heat of your heart. Keep me from the cold. Got the currents of will to take me to your soul. Made a map of your mind to take me to your soul. Made a map of your mind to take me to your soul. To your soul. To your soul. To your soul. To your soul.
Very nice, very nice.
Thank you.
Map of your mind. You have the intuition that maybe through art you can get into the soul of the other person. That's why music is so potent.
Yes, you know, music, unlike many things in life, it has a special way of getting into kind of the sweet spot of emotion and memory, kind of, you know, how just like a few notes of a song can take you back to some ancient time in your life where something fantastic happened, and your first kiss, for example. And it's just a powerful, powerful thing. It penetrates your mind and kind of opens you up into memories and emotions and to your whole mental existence in a way.
You know, there is one Mexican neuroscientist, José Luis Díaz, that says that science has some kind of brainscopes. Instead of telescope, you have a kind of brainscope with EEG, MRI, the different instruments. What can do science to try to understand this problem? We have to talk maybe about the research of Giacomo Rizzolatti and the mirror neurons, yes?
So yes, that's one approach. Another approach is directly studying theory of mind, for example. There's been a lot of work. There's fantastic work by Chris and Uta Frith in the United Kingdom at University College London, where they've studied how the brain is activated when people are adopting the mind of another person. So the prefrontal cortex, again, is a very important structure for that, because it allows you to take the perspective of another person. And again, it's about using imagination. That's what the prefrontal cortex is very good at, using the imagination to go into places that don't necessarily exist in your mind, but go there in another mind or into the future or other things like that. So they've done fantastic work on that, and lots of other people as well. And that research, again, is now being applied to autism to try and understand what is, you know, why do autistic people have these problems getting into the minds of others. And I think one of the conclusions is that they lack the ability to have self-referential understanding of their own mind, and therefore they can't put that into another person's mind because it's missing in them.
A map of your own mind to understand the map of the other mind.
They don't have a good theory of mind, therefore they can't have a theory of mind of another person.
Yes, and but the problem is we have walls of ignorance, walls of fears. And this also makes it difficult to try to understand the other. Yes. Let's talk about social fear and how this is installed in collective consciousness. Because when we know what is fear, some politicians take use of that fear. Yes.
Well, that's not a new thing. That's been happening since ancient times.
Yes,
that
yes.
Politicians use fear to motivate their own interest or their perceived interest of the country.
If you want to raise ratings, you put fear in the programs.
So we actually have a new album coming out called A River of Hope and Love Runs Through a Dark Abyss, and it's about the current political situation in the United States. And the world, in a way.
What it excites exactly this fear, and what we should fear about fear? I mean, this is something very important because we have misconceptions about what is fear and how is it produced, but what science has revealed that goes beyond the commonplace.
So I think, you know, part of the problem is that scientists sometimes, in the effort to simplify and study things get lost from the point where they started. So scientists, if you're interested in psychology, for example, you're a scientist and you study psychology, where can you get your inspiration? You have to get it from the only place you know, which is inside your own head. So we have fears, like everyone else. Scientists have fears and loves and hates and angers and all of that. So when we decide to study that, we have to turn it into some kind of experiment. We have to measure something. It's very hard to measure consciousness. What can we measure? We measure behavior. And, you know, as we were saying, because behavior and the conscious feeling of fear go together in our lives, we think that if we study the behavior, it will help us understand the fear. So I think what people think of fear is correct. It's that feeling you have when you're in danger. But the scientists have turned it into a behavioral measure, and that doesn't accurately get at the problem. So I think probably it's necessary to study consciousness and human emotions in humans. And because I don't think we can study that in animals.
But without being invasive, that's the challenge.
That's the challenge, and also because, you know, is it ethical to
go inside the other brain?
Well, to induce emotions in people.
Yes.
For example, can you really induce strong fear in the laboratory in a person? No, you can't. That's unethical.
Exactly.
Because you don't know what other history that person has, so if you make that person really afraid, that might have long-term consequences for them.
But then what's interesting is that there are other instruments that we have to know what is inside the mind. Yeah. And in this way, we come to art and to novels, because novels are documentation of what is happening in our brain. Let's talk about it, please.
So I think, you know, a novel is kind of a narrative in a sense, and so a lot of our conscious minds are narratives. We are constantly, you know, there's a little narrative running in your head all the time. When you try to go to sleep, that you can't shut that narrative off, right? So it's there all the time. My earliest research on the brain was in graduate school when I was studying these patients that have their brains sliced in half to control epilepsy, so-called split brain patients. This is a very rare operation done only in the most severe cases where nothing else is helping. And so what's interesting is that the right hemisphere, which can't speak, can still process information. So we did experiments where we would induce the right hemisphere to perform behaviors. And then we would ask the person, in other words, you're talking to the left hemisphere, why did you do that? So you know, we would make the right hemisphere stand up, so the person's body stands up. So now the left hemisphere sees that he stood up, and so you say, why did you stand up? He says, I needed to stretch. So if we made the right hemisphere laugh, say, why did you laugh? You guys are really funny. When we said, oh, wave. So he does this. And so we said, why'd you wave? He said, well, I thought I saw a friend outside. So none of these are like, you know, I'm thinking, let me make up an explanation. These are just natural interpretations of behaviors being produced by your body. So this happens to us all the time, that we don't always plan everything that we're trying to do, right? Things just happen to us. And so the idea I had at that point was that emotion systems in the brain might be one thing that's producing behaviors that we aren't conscious of, and that we have to generate a narrative to explain. And that's why I started studying animals, to understand these narratives. So I think we can come back now, and at the late point of my career, what I want to do is study humans more and try to understand consciousness and emotions and narratives and things like that.
And which novelist really is very important for you in doing this kind of research? Because you have...
Well, the poets are very useful, like Emily Dickinson, I think. But maybe Borges, I don't know.
Borges.
Yes, it's interesting stuff there.
And, you know, something very interesting that it has to do also with this research of trying to see how, for example, Gerald Edelman, the Nobel Prize, he once said that, well, he says that the most mysterious thing about trying to understand the brain is how matter becomes imagination. So this is called the hard problem.
Yes.
Let's talk about it.
Well, you know, when you make it into a hard problem, it becomes harder.
Yes, yes. There are Chalmers said that there were two problems,
right.
Soft problem and hard problem.
But I think that, you know, in a sense that, you know, Chalmers is basically a dualist.
Mm-hmm.
So for him, it's a hard problem because he doesn't think we can really get to it so much. But if you're a materialist and a scientist in the sense that you think that, you know, even when Edelman said that the imagination, how matter becomes imagination, imagination is matter. I mean, there's no mystery there. It's just we have to figure out how it happens. If we make it too spooky, then it becomes, you know, I think it makes it harder to study. I think we have to accept that our minds are material events. You know, things that happen in our mind are part of the material world. We just have to understand it.
You had a correspondence with David Chalmers. He sent you emails trying to figure out this problem. Let's talk about this debate that you have had with him.
I don't know.
Yes, there is one email in which he explains to you, or he says to you, about this dualist approach, and why he says that, for example, love cannot be reduced to an algorithm, or you can just say, you can just say the neural correlatives of that experience, but that's not the experience itself.
I don't remember that email.
Yes, in your book, The Anxiety. Well, it doesn't matter.
Okay, I mean, I guess I have to read my book.
Read your mind, read my mind, and read the book.
No, this happens a lot. You know, I wrote like The Emotional Brain in 1996, and people ask me about things I wrote and say, oh, I wrote that.
But nevertheless, the important thing is that you have a lively discussion about this problem. And in your songs, there is the longing of seeing how these love experiences come about. Right. And do you really think that they can get reduced to brain?
I wouldn't say reduced. I'm committed to the idea that they are brain experiences. I'm not saying we can ever understand it. It may be incredibly complicated. But I'm committed to the idea that everything we experience is part of our brain.
How it gets transformed? Let's talk about this, because this is the real problem. How does matter becomes imagination? I understand that this is really very difficult to tackle, but what is interesting of science is you have to have the arrogance and the humility, both at the same time, of trying to understand.
So my view, let's talk about fear.
Yes.
Is that each person's fears are unique, because fear is a product of a schema in the brain. A schema is a body of knowledge that has been acquired as you learn your life. From the earliest days of childhood, when you begin to encounter dangerous things or harmful things, you begin to build up a catalog of experiences and facts about what danger is. And that catalog gets much more complicated as you get older and older, because you have more and more information to put in it. And as you begin to have words like fear, you begin to think of that as a category of experience. And then you begin to partition it into, well, fear is different from anxiety. It's different from terror. You know, being terrified is worse than just being kind of afraid. Panic is a different form. And so we have all these words that kind of help us chop up our reality. And so the schema has all of the things that you've learned about fear in your life, the ways that you typically respond to danger, the way one generally responds to danger, but also how you respond when you're in a dangerous situation. All these things become available to you when your schema is pattern completed by the presence, for example, of a threat. Snake at your feet opens up that whole world of fear that you've acquired throughout your life. And that then allows you to, that provides a kind of non-conscious template out of which your conscious experience emerges. So it becomes a matter of having that schema representation in prefrontal cortex as a non-conscious event that then is re-represented as a conscious experience by another representation. So that's my theory. I mean, people will challenge that, and not everyone will agree with it, but it's a kind of explanation of how a subjective experience emerges from non-conscious events that we've built up through a long history of experience. And we have these schema for every emotion that we experience. And that's what allows us to have that emotion, is this schema.
You say that this is possible because fear is maybe more easy to understand or to...
No, love, we have everything you've learned about love you have in your brain is a love schema, and so when you fall in love, you recognize the feelings and the situation you're in as one of love, and that becomes part of what you experience as love.
But can you have predictability?
Predictability?
Yeah. With those emotions and with those maps, you're trying to understand fear, you're trying to understand love, but I feel that there is a lot of uncertainty.
Oh yes, absolutely. That's why we play music.
So let's have another song.
Okay,
please.
let's My Mind's Eye.
Exactly, that has to do with that. Yeah.
So a lot of our songs are about the conscious mind and the interactions with unconscious processes, and this one is about that interaction. It's about how our conscious mind sometimes doesn't exactly know what's going on, and tricks are played on it by the unconscious mind.
Ready?
Yes.
1, 2, 3. If you look into my mind's eye, you would see the way that I cry deep inside in my mind's eye. We had love, it was good. You were there, you understood everything, yes, everything. You can't always trust what you think you know. You can't trust what you believe. And sometimes your mind just puts on a show. It simply deceives. My mind's eye, you were mine, but my mind's eye was blind. If you look into my mind's eye, you would see the way that I cry deep inside. Yes, my mind's eye. You can't always trust what you think you know. You can't trust what you believe. And sometimes your mind just puts on a show. It simply deceives. My mind's eye, you were mine, but my mind's eye was blind. My mind's eye was blind. My mind's eye was blind. Oh yeah, my mind's eye was blind.
Very, very nice. Very nice. And you know, there is a longing, such a longing to really be in touch with the other.
Are you analyzing me now?
I am having empathy with you.
Thank you.
And the most important thing is what are the challenges you're seeing nowadays in neuroscience to tackle with this kind of problems?
So, you know, we're at a point in neuroscience where the technical sophistication is tremendous. We can turn genes on, turn them off in specific parts of the brain, identify circuits. But our ability to understand the brain is only as good as our understanding of what we're asking of the brain. And so if we misunderstand something like fear and pursue it in the wrong way, then it leads to problems in understanding what the research is about.
Dead ends also.
Yeah. So then we have to backtrack, and yes, that's how science is. We go up, we go down. It's kind of iterative. You know, there are steps. So sometimes you step back, and you have to move forward. So I don't think it's necessarily bad, because we're just always, you know, trying to move forward, and that sometimes takes us back a few steps, and then we go forward. So that's just how science is. It's iterative, you know. It builds on the past and tries to move to the future, but sometimes you have to backtrack a little bit to get to the future.
And what it amazes most of all this road you have taken to know the brain? What really strikes you as something that is amazing while doing your research?
Well, I guess both how simple and how complex it is. It's simple in the sense that if you have a good idea and you're able to turn it into a good set of experiments, you can make progress really quickly. So, for example, when we started studying so-called fear responses, we had a very precise stimulus, a very precise response. The stimulus was the pure tone, an auditory stimulus. The response was freezing behavior. And so it was just a matter of connecting the auditory system in the brain with the muscles, motor system, connecting the dots. And if you have a good input and a good output, you can connect the dots. But then you end up with something relatively simple. And if you now take that simple thing and give it a complicated name like fear, that seems like we've solved the problem, because we think we've solved the problem of fear. But all we really know is how the brain freezes and does other kinds of flight-fight responses. So we have to not be too quick to overinterpret what the behavior means. We have to always be asking ourselves, what is this behavior about? What is it telling us? And I think if we are introspective and careful about what we are asking the brain, then we can make more progress without having to step back so often.
And with this research, what hope there is to fight in more precise ways anxiety and fear?
Yes, so, you know, even though I think animal research can't tell us about the conscious experience of fear, it tells us all about the engine, all the underpinnings of all of that. It's very important. And so we shouldn't be disappointed that drugs that are developed through animals only change behavior, because changing behavior is very important. But we also have to realize that it's not the final answer. We also have to be able to improve our ability to get into the subjectivity of the other person. So psychotherapy needs to improve. Everything needs to always improve. We can't be stuck in the past ways. We always have to be asking, how can we get to better conceptions? And it all starts with our conception of what it is we're asking of the brain. We have to be very precise about that. If we get too fuzzy about that, we go down the wrong road.
And in this way, you also, through songs, make this point. So,
try to.
Science can give us glimpses of hope regarding how to fight fear if we have the right instruments and the right questions. But also, art can give us an insight into what is happening with us and if we really can't touch the other. So it's very accurate then to finish this beautiful talk with a song that is called The Mind-Body Problem.
1, 2, 3, 4. I got a mind-body problem. Don't know what to do. I got a problem. I don't know what to said you'd always love me. To me you'd be true. You said you'd love me. To me you'd be true. Well, now you're gone and down and blue. I got a mind-body problem. It's got a problem. I don't know what to do. Don't know what to do. I got a problem. Don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. Ah, my body wants you so. My mind says no, 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 no. I even tried religion to get over you. I even tried religion to get over you. But holy dualism couldn't solve my schism. You got me trembling and shaking. Trembling, shaking. I'm craving you. He's craving you. I'm trembling and shaking. He's trembling, shaking. I'm craving you. He's craving you. Oh, I'm insane. Blood and in pain. Problem. I don't know what to do. Whoa, I've got a problem. I just don't know what to do. My body wants you so. My mind says no.
Bravo, bravo. Just to see how brain and songs can try to get into the mystery of really trying to understand the other person. Thank you very much, Joseph LeDoux, that with neuroscience, and Colin Dempsey, with neuroscience, with science, and with songs, you try to penetrate the mystery of the mind.
Thank you for having
very
us.
much.
Thank
really.
you.
Muchísimas gracias. Hemos terminado así este programa especial de grandes pensadores contemporáneos. Very good. Yes.